Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, the autumn rain pelting against the windshield in an unrelenting rhythm. The wipers squeaked back and forth, a metronome counting down to the most important day of her life. Beside her, Max, her 3-year-old golden retriever with soft caramel fur and eyes that somehow understood human suffering, rested his massive head against the passenger window. The dog had been with her through everything: the panic attacks at 3 a.m., the therapy sessions, the hospital stay 18 months ago, the lonely nights when she wondered if she was failing as a mother. Now, as they drove toward the courthouse, Sarah wasn't sure which of them was comforting the other. It was 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday. Court was supposed to begin at 9:00 a.m. sharp, and Judge Harrison was not a woman who tolerated tardiness. Sarah knew this because her attorney, Jim, had told her 3 times during their last meeting, each time with increasing emphasis, as if repetition could somehow prepare her for the verdict that would determine the trajectory of her life. She'd been awake since 4:15 a.m., lying in bed beside Tommy, her 8-year-old son, watching him sleep. His small hand had been fisted around her sleeve, and she'd been terrified to move, terrified to break the moment. At 5:47 a.m., she'd given up on rest and gotten out of bed, careful not to disturb him. She'd made coffee she didn't drink and showered with water so hot it left her skin red and angry. Sarah hadn't slept properly in 37 hours. She knew this exact number because she'd been counting obsessively, as if the act of quantifying her sleeplessness somehow proved her desperation. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw a cold smile. Mitchell, her ex-husband of 2 years, though they'd separated 3 years before that. With his perfectly gelled hair, his expensive suits that whispered money, his new girlfriend Amber, who was 16 years younger and looked at Tommy with the affection one might show a stranger's child, who had filed for full custody claiming that Sarah was emotionally unstable and unfit to parent. The words emotionally unstable had become a weapon wielded against her, a scarlet letter that appeared in every document filed by his legal team. Yes, she'd had an anxiety disorder. Yes, she'd spent 4 weeks in a psychiatric facility after a particularly severe panic attack last year. Yes, she'd missed work occasionally when her hands shook too badly to type, when the walls seemed to close in and her breath came in stuttering gasps. But that wasn't the whole story. That wasn't the truth. The truth was that she'd fought back. She'd found medication that worked. She'd done therapy religiously. She'd rebuilt herself piece by piece, and through it all she'd never, not once, let Tommy feel the weight of her struggles. She'd protected him, fiercely, desperately, completely. Max whimpered softly, sensing the tension radiating from Sarah. She reached over and scratched behind his ears, feeling the soft velvet of them between her fingers. This dog had cost her nearly $3,000, money she'd barely had, because a therapist had suggested he might help Tommy cope with the separation. And he had helped. More than helped. Max had become Tommy's anchor during the darkest hours, the living embodiment of unconditional love in a world that suddenly felt chaotic and unreliable. When Tommy woke up screaming from nightmares about his parents' screaming matches, Max would jump onto his bed and refuse to leave until the boy fell back asleep. When Tommy's anxiety spiked during the transition days between houses, Max would rest his head on the boy's lap and stay there for hours. The courthouse loomed ahead, a gray stone building that looked designed to intimidate. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. She pulled into the parking garage and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm her racing heart. His legal team was formidable. Richardson and Associates, a boutique law firm known for their aggressive tactics in family court. They'd spent the last 8 months building a case against her, systematically dismantling her credibility, painting her as a woman barely holding it together. They'd obtained hospital records. They'd gathered testimony from people she'd worked with years ago. They'd even managed to locate an old friend from college who claimed Sarah had always been emotionally dramatic. Jim, her attorney, a kind man in his 60s who'd offered her a significantly reduced rate because he believed in her case, had warned her that the odds weren't favorable. The system, he'd said grimly, often favors the parent with more financial resources and fewer complications in their history. A successful businessman with a stable home and no mental health issues on record. You're a freelance graphic designer with a documented psychiatric hospitalization. He hadn't said it cruelly, he'd said it factually, the way a doctor might inform a patient that their condition was serious. But serious was an understatement. Serious was Sarah's life unraveling thread by thread. She stepped out of the car and Max followed. The cool autumn air hit her face and she took several deep breaths. The courthouse steps stretched before her like a mountain she had to climb. At the top of those steps waited his smug legal team. Waited a judge who had never met her, who knew her only through documents and testimony, who had the power to decide whether she got to keep her son. The thought made her knees feel weak. "Come on, boy," she whispered to Max, and together they climbed the steps. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was sterile and cold. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. People in suits hurried past with clipboards and briefcases. Sarah found the correct courtroom 207 and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Her breath caught. Was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with his entire team. Richardson, 2 junior associates, and a legal secretary. They looked like a military battalion. Beside sat Amber, his girlfriend, looking appropriately sad in a navy dress that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. They didn't look at Sarah, but she could feel their awareness of her presence, the way predators are aware of prey. Jim was waiting for her in the gallery. His face was encouraging, but his eyes betrayed his worry. He gestured for Sarah to sit beside him. She did, and Max settled at her feet, his warm body providing an anchor. The bailiff was reviewing some documents. A court reporter sat at her station, fingers poised over her stenotype machine. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching her life happen to someone else. "You ready?" Jim whispered. Sarah wasn't ready. She would never be ready. But she nodded anyway because that's what mothers do. They pretend to be brave even when terror is clawing at their throats. She reached down and felt Max's solid presence beneath the table. She closed her eyes and thought of Tommy's face, Tommy's laugh, Tommy's small hand in hers. She thought of all the nights she'd held him while he cried, all the days she'd fought to be strong enough for both of them, all the moments when she'd wanted to give up but hadn't because he needed her to be better. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harrison entered and everyone stood. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. Judge Harrison settled into her chair with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. She was in her early 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses that dangled from a beaded chain around her neck. Her reputation preceded her, 30 years on the bench, an 87% appeal rate in her favor, known for cutting through emotional arguments and focusing purely on facts and precedent. She had no patience for sentimentality, and she certainly had no sympathy for parents who let their personal struggles interfere with their children's welfare. As she surveyed the courtroom, her eyes passed over Sarah without a flicker of recognition or warmth. "This is the custody case of Mitchell versus Mitchell," the bailiff announced. "Regarding the minor child, Thomas James Mitchell, age 8. Richardson stood immediately, his movements deliberate and theatrical. He was a tall man with sharp features and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were the person in the room, or at least believing you were. His suit was charcoal gray, his tie a subtle power red. Every element of his appearance had been calculated to project authority and success. He approached the judge's bench with the familiarity of someone who'd stood there hundreds of times before. "Your Honor, we intend to present evidence today that demonstrates why my client, Mitchell, is the appropriate custodial parent for young Thomas. The evidence will show a pattern of emotional instability, poor judgment, and an inability to provide consistent, stable parenting on the part of the respondent, Miss Sarah Mitchell." Jim immediately stood to object, but Judge Harrison raised her hand. "Save your objections for when they're relevant, Mr. Proceed, Mr. Richardson." Richardson smiled, a thin, predatory smile. He gestured to a junior associate who rolled a television on a stand into position. Sarah's stomach clenched. She knew what was coming. She'd known for weeks. His legal team had obtained security footage from outside her apartment building. They had edited it meticulously, and Jim had warned her about it multiple times. The video showed her on 17 separate occasions over a 3-month period, looking distressed, moving erratically, occasionally sitting on the front steps for hours at a time. "These recordings," Richardson began, his voice carrying the tone of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence, "were taken between February and April of last year, during the respondent's self-imposed hospitalization for what she claims was acute anxiety." The footage began to play. There was Sarah, unmistakably, standing outside her apartment building. In one clip, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her keys. In another, she was packing back and forth, her shoulders hunched, her entire body language screaming distress. In a third, she was sitting on the concrete steps, her face buried in her hands. The video had been edited to be devastating. It showed the absolute worst moments, strung together to create a narrative of complete psychological breakdown. Sarah felt her face burning. She wanted to explain that this was during one of the worst weeks, when her medication adjustment had gone wrong, when she'd felt like she was drowning. She wanted to explain that this was precisely why she'd admitted herself voluntarily, that she'd gotten help, that she'd been trying to protect Tommy by removing herself from the situation. But the judge's face remained impassive, watching the footage like it was irrefutable evidence of her unfitness. "Your Honor," Jim objected, "this footage is taken out of context. These were difficult days, but the respondent sought professional help." "Objection noted and overruled," Judge Harrison said coolly. "The footage speaks for itself." Richardson pressed forward. "We will now hear from witnesses who can attest to the respondent's unstable mental state." The first witness was called. His mother, Mitchell. She was a thin, elegant woman in her 70s, dressed in pearls and designer clothing. She took the stand and placed her hand on the Bible with the solemnity of someone about to save the world. Richardson guided her through a series of leading questions, and she answered each one with the precision of someone who'd been coached extensively. "Mrs. Mitchell, have you ever been concerned about your former daughter-in-law's mental state?" Richardson asked. "Oh yes, many times," answered, shaking her head sadly. "Even before the hospitalization. She would call crying at all hours. She'd have what I can only describe as episodes. There was one Thanksgiving when she became so anxious about cooking that she locked herself in a bathroom for 2 hours." Sarah wanted to scream. That episode had been a severe panic attack triggered by her demanding mother-in-law criticizing everything she was doing. It wasn't a sign of incompetence. It was a sign of having boundaries violated. But the courtroom didn't see it that way. Several jurors, there were 6 on the jury for this civil proceeding, looked at with sympathy. Then came's girlfriend, Amber. She wore a dress that was somehow both demure and revealing, and she with the wide-eyed innocence of someone who'd never experienced a genuinely difficult day in her life. She spoke about observing Tommy on transition days, saying the boy seemed anxious and worried about his mother, that he'd mentioned Sarah having bad days. "Did he ever elaborate on what he meant by bad days?" Richardson asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "Oh yes. He said sometimes his mom would be really sad and wouldn't get out of bed, that she'd cry a lot. He seemed worried about her, actually, like he was the adult and she was the child." It was a brilliant move, Sarah realized. By using Tommy's words, spoken in the innocent way children speak when they're trying to process complex adult emotions, they'd made it sound like Sarah was emotionally burdening her child. But the truth was more nuanced. Yes, Tommy had seen her struggle. Yes, he'd understood that his mother had bad days, but she'd never made him feel responsible for her. She'd never asked him to take care of her. If anything, she'd worked desperately hard to shield him from the worst of it. Then came the testimony from Sarah's old supervisor at the graphic design firm where she'd worked before going freelance. A woman named Carol who'd clearly been coached by Richardson's team. That Sarah had taken numerous personal days, that she'd seemed distracted and unfocused, that there had been concerns about her reliability. "Did there ever come a point," Richardson asked, "when you felt concerned about Miss Mitchell's ability to perform her job duties?" "Yes, definitely. I remember one particular project where she just seemed unable to focus. She'd been working on a design for 3 days, and it looked like she'd never done it before, very unlike her usual work." What Carol didn't mention was that 3 days was right after Sarah's medication had been adjusted. What she didn't mention was that Sarah had eventually delivered exceptional work once she'd stabilized. What she didn't mention was that Sarah had always been one of the most competent designers on her team. But Richardson didn't ask about any of that, and Jim's cross-examination couldn't undo the damage already done. By the time the lunch break arrived, Sarah felt utterly devastated. The courtroom had transformed her mental health struggles into evidence of her incompetence as a mother. Her bravery in seeking help had been reframed as proof of her instability. Her vulnerability had been weaponized. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the narrative taking shape in her mind. Here was a woman too broken, too damaged, too unstable to be trusted with a child's welfare. Jim touched her shoulder gently. "This is typical," he said quietly. "They're going to present the worst version of you, but we'll get our turn." Sarah wasn't convinced. As she sat in the bathroom stall later, trying to compose herself, she realized that Jim's confidence might not be enough. The system seemed designed to punish people like her, people who struggled, who admitted their struggles, who sought treatment. By contrast, seemed to exist on a different plane entirely. He was financially successful, emotionally stable, and completely unburdened by human fragility. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of this courtroom, he was everything Sarah was not. And the afternoon session was still to come. The bathroom at the courthouse was empty when Sarah pushed through the heavy door. She moved directly to the sink and gripped the edges, her knuckles turning white. The fluorescent lights above reflected off the polished surfaces, creating a clinical, sterile environment that felt utterly divorced from human emotion. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her eyes were swollen from barely holding back tears. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. There were dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She looked exactly like what Richardson had painted her as, a broken woman barely holding herself together. Behind her, the bathroom door swung open. A woman in a business suit entered, glanced at Sarah with something between pity and disgust, and moved quickly to a stall. Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. She fled, pushing through the door and finding herself in a quiet hallway that connected to a smaller courthouse break room. It was empty except for a tired-looking man in maintenance clothes restocking paper towels. Sarah sat on the hard plastic chair and let her hands shake openly now that no one was watching. She had lost. She knew it with absolute certainty. The case was over, had won before they'd even gotten to her side of the argument. His legal team had been surgical in their destruction of her character, and they'd done it while maintaining the appearance of professional concern. They turned her honesty, her willingness to admit that she struggled with anxiety, her decision to seek help, into evidence of her unfitness. In its narrative, her bravery became cowardice. Her vulnerability became weakness. Her love for Tommy became a potential threat. Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands and opened her photos. She scrolled through pictures of Tommy at his school play, Tommy building with Lego, Tommy's face buried against Max's fur while they watched a movie. Her baby. Her beautiful, resilient, loving baby boy. He was depending on her, and she was about to lose him because the law seemed designed to punish people who struggled with mental health rather than reward them for fighting their way back. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother who was babysitting Tommy. "How's it going? Tommy is asking about you. He's worried." Sarah's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Tommy was worried about her while she was fighting to keep custody of him. The irony was so painful it felt like a physical blow. She typed back, "Tell him I love him more than anything. Tell him I'm being brave." But was she? Sarah wondered. Was she really being brave, or was she just watching her life fall apart? Bravery implied you had some control over the outcome. Bravery implied you could fight back and win. What was it called when you were simply drowning? She sat alone in that break room for a long time, watching people pass by the glass walls, lawyers in their expensive suits, court clerks carrying files, security guards making their rounds. Everyone seemed so certain, so assured in their roles. Sarah felt like a fraud. She didn't belong in a courtroom. She didn't belong in a custody battle. She belonged at home with her son, building blanket forts and making silly voices for stuffed animals, and pretending that the world wasn't falling apart. Around 1:45 p.m., Jim found her. He sat down beside her without saying anything for a moment. Then, "I know this is bad. I know how it looks, but we have our experts and we have our evidence that you're stable now. We're going to—" "Jim, stop," Sarah interrupted quietly. "We both know they won. We both know how this is going to end. Richardson didn't leave any room for doubt. He built a perfect case, and now the judge is sitting there wondering how could possibly trust me with his son." Jim was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not wrong. The odds are not favorable." The admission hung in the air between them like a death knell. Sarah stood up abruptly, unable to sit still anymore. She walked to the window overlooking the courthouse's interior courtyard. A few people walked below and birds pecked at the ground looking for crumbs. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching life happen through glass. That's when the memory hit her. It was from 3 weeks ago, late at night. Tommy had been struggling with nightmares about custody, about losing one parent or the other. He'd woken up crying at 2 a.m. and Sarah had brought him into her bed. They'd lain there in the dark, his small body pressed against hers, and he'd asked her a question that had broken her heart. "Mommy, what if the judge doesn't like you? What if he thinks you're too broken?" She'd held him and said, "Then I'll just have to show him that broken things can still be strong." Tommy had been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said something that had stuck with her, like how Max shows us he loves us even when we're sad, like how the dog just knows what to do. They'd stayed awake talking about Max, about how the dog seemed to understand their pain without needing words, about how Max's presence alone could calm their racing hearts. Tommy had suggested, in the way children sometimes stumble onto profound wisdom, that they create a secret command that Max could do to show other people how much love and strength they really had inside them. A command that meant "show them I'm okay" or "show them we're okay." Sarah had taught Max the command over the following weeks. It was simple but powerful, the phrase "show them your heart, Max." She'd paired it with specific training. Max would stand calmly, walk to whoever needed to see his love, and rest his chin on them with perfect composure. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a performance. It was just the dog communicating pure, unconditional acceptance and love. Tommy had practiced with her, and they'd turned it into a game, a ritual, a way of reminding each other that even in the darkest moments, they had something real and beautiful between them. At the time, they'd done it because it made Tommy feel brave, because it gave them both a sense of agency in a situation where they felt helpless. But now, standing in this courthouse break room, Sarah realized something else. The command represented truth. Not the carefully edited truth that Richardson had presented, not the narrative constructed by expensive lawyers and hostile witnesses, but the real truth. The truth that Sarah loved her son more than anything. The truth that she'd fought her way back from the edge. The truth that broken people could still be strong. The truth that love was real even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. Jim cleared his throat. "We need to head back. The afternoon session starts in 15 minutes. Sarah turned to face him, and something in her expression must have shifted because he looked at her with sudden concern. "What?" he asked. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Sarah said slowly, "that maybe there's one more thing we haven't tried." "What do you mean?" "Sarah, we need to stick to the strategy." "The strategy isn't working," Sarah interrupted. "They've already won the game the way it's being played. But what if we change the game? What if we showed the judge something that can't be edited, can't be twisted, can't be weaponized by lawyers and testimony?" Jim frowned, clearly confused. "What are you talking about?" Sarah looked out at Max through the courtroom window. The dog was lying peacefully on a bench in the gallery, waiting for his girl. She thought about Tommy, about his brave little face, about his absolute faith that she could fight her way through this. She thought about the command they'd practiced, the secret they shared, the truth it represented. "I'm going to show Judge Harrison who I really am," Sarah said quietly. "Not through testimony or evidence. I'm going to show her through Max." "Sarah, I don't think." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was walking back toward the courtroom, her heart pounding, her mind crystallizing around a single desperate hope. It was risky. It was unconventional. It probably wouldn't work. But she'd already lost everything else. What did she have to lose? The afternoon session began at 2:15 p.m. precisely. Judge Harrison took her seat with the same stern authority she displayed that morning, and the bailiff called the court back into session. The afternoon light streamed through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Sarah sat at the defendant's table beside Jim, with Max resting at her feet. The dog seemed unusually calm, almost as if he sensed the importance of what was about to happen, and his legal team occupied their table across the aisle, Richardson arranging papers with theatrical precision. Jim began his opening remarks for the afternoon portion of the proceedings. His voice was steady and measured, but Sarah could hear the strain underneath. He presented the medical evidence, recent psychiatric evaluations showing that Sarah was stable and functioning well. He discussed her employment as a freelance graphic designer, proving that she was financially independent. He highlighted the letters of recommendation from Tommy's school, from her therapist, from neighbors who'd never witnessed anything concerning. But it wasn't working. Sarah could see it in the judge's face, in the subtle way she'd tilt her head slightly, the way her eyes would glaze over. The narrative from the morning was too powerful, too well-crafted. Richardson's evidence had been visceral, video footage, emotional testimony, the image of a broken woman sitting on apartment steps. Jim's evidence was clinical, impersonal, easily dismissible. Facts on paper couldn't compete with the emotional devastation they'd already presented. The bailiff called Sarah to the stand. She stood on shaky legs and walked to the witness box, placing her hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. Her voice felt small and fragile as she answered Jim's first questions: her name, her occupation, her relationship to Tommy. "Miss Mitchell," Jim said carefully, "can you explain your mental health history in your own words?" Sarah took a breath. This was her chance to tell her story, to present herself as a real person rather than a collection of incriminating evidence. She spoke about her anxiety disorder, about recognizing the signs, about making the decision to seek help. She talked about her voluntary hospitalization, framing it not as weakness but as strength, as a mother choosing to take care of herself so she could be present for her son. "I could have hidden my struggles," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I could have pretended everything was fine and kept deteriorating, but I love my son too much for that. I got help because I wanted to be the best mother I could possibly be for him." It was a good answer. Jim nodded approvingly, but across the aisle, Richardson was already preparing his cross-examination. Sarah could see him reviewing his notes, circling sections he intended to attack. The moment of hope deflated before it had even fully inflated. Richardson stood and approached with the predatory grace of a shark moving through blood-filled water. His first questions were innocuous, biographical information, her work history. But then came the pivot. "Miss Mitchell, when you were hospitalized, were you working?" "No, So you abandoned your job responsibilities to deal with your mental crisis. Is that correct?" I took medical leave. You abandoned your job, Richardson repeated, not as a question but as a statement, as if the truth of the accusation was self-evident. And during that time, who was caring for your son? My mother was staying with us and had visitation. So you were incapable of caring for your own child and had to rely on others. That must have been difficult for young Tommy, being shuffled between caregivers while his mother was hospitalized for mental illness. Sarah wanted to explain that Tommy had been cared for, that he hadn't suffered, that mental illness wasn't a moral failing. But Richardson wasn't interested in her explanation. He was interested in control, in dominating the narrative, in reducing her to a cautionary tale. Jim objected repeatedly, but Judge Harrison overruled him almost every time. Richardson continued his assault, attacking every defense, every explanation, every attempt Sarah made to contextualize her struggle. By the time he finished his cross-examination, Sarah felt smaller, more broken, more defeated than she had that morning. She was excused from the stand at 3:47 p.m. As she walked back to her seat, she caught sight of Max. The dog's eyes were fixed on her with intense focus. He knew something was wrong. He always knew. Sarah settled back into her chair, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Jim was called upon to present his expert witness, Doctor, a clinical psychologist who'd been working with Sarah for the past year. Doctor, that Sarah was stable, that her anxiety was well managed with medication and therapy, that her mental health struggles were not indicative of poor parenting ability. It was competent testimony, professional and thorough. But it felt hollow, defensive, like they were simply trying to repair damage that had already been done. Then came Richardson's expert witness, Doctor, a psychiatrist who'd reviewed Sarah's medical records but never met her. That hospitalization for anxiety typically indicated a significant level of dysfunction, and that while Sarah might be currently stable, her history suggested an underlying predisposition to emotional instability that could resurface under stress. It was brilliant testimony because it was technically accurate while being devastatingly misleading. Yes, people who needed hospitalization had experienced significant dysfunction. Yes, anxiety disorders could resurface under stress. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that Sarah had fought her way to stability, that she was managing her condition, that she was committed to her son. But none of that seemed to matter in the face of Doctor's clinical skepticism. The afternoon wore on. More witnesses were called. More arguments were made. The judge took copious notes, her expression remaining inscrutable. Sarah felt the case slipping away from her, moment by moment, piece by piece. Her last chance was evaporating. At 4:52 p.m., Jim delivered his closing argument. He spoke eloquently about Sarah's courage, her resilience, her deep and abiding love for her son. He cited case law about mental health discrimination. He presented the statistics on anxiety disorders, emphasizing that millions of functional, stable people struggled with the same condition Sarah struggled with. It was a well-crafted argument, passionate and evidence-based. But Richardson's response was crushing in its simplicity. He stood and said, "Your Honor, this case isn't about whether Miss Mitchell can manage her anxiety. It's about whether a child is better served living with a parent who has experienced psychiatric hospitalization or a parent who provides stable, uncomplicated emotional support. The choice is clear." The judge nodded slightly. She opened her mouth to call for a brief recess before delivering her ruling. Sarah felt the world tilting. This was it. This was the moment where she was going to lose Tommy. And that's when she made her decision. As the judge was about to speak, Sarah leaned down toward Max. The bailiff was distracted, reviewing courtroom procedures on his phone. Richardson was gathering his papers. Judge Harrison's attention was on her notes. It was a small window, barely a moment. Sarah whispered the words they'd practiced 100 times, the words she and Tommy had created together during their darkest nights. "Show them your heart, Max. Show them I'm okay." Max's body tensed. His entire demeanor shifted from resting to focused. Without hesitation, without any dramatic flourish or attention-seeking behavior, Max stood up. The movement was deliberate and graceful. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply stood and began walking. The courtroom fell silent. Richardson's hand froze mid-motion. Eyes widened. The bailiff straightened up, uncertain how to respond. Judge Harrison looked up from her notes, confusion crossing her face. Max walked directly toward the judge's bench, not aggressively, not playfully, but with an almost ceremonial purpose. His movements were measured and calm. Every eye in the courtroom was on him. The judge started to lean back, but Max didn't stop. He approached the bench and gently, with perfect composure and absolute grace, rested his chin on the edge of the judge's desk. The courtroom erupted into confused murmurs. The attorney stood up, shouting an objection. The bailiff moved forward uncertainly, but Judge Harrison raised her hand silently, commanding attention without words. She stared at Max, and Max stared back at her, and in that moment something shifted in the room. Something fundamental changed. The judge slowly reached out her hand. Max remained perfectly still, allowing her fingers to touch his fur. She let her hand rest there, her stern judicial expression faltering for just a moment, just a fraction of a second where the hardness fell away and something almost human emerged. "Order," the judge said quietly, and the courtroom obeyed. Judge Harrison had presided over 347 custody cases in her 30-year career on the bench. She prided herself on her objectivity, her ability to set aside emotion and focus purely on the law, on precedent, on facts. She had developed a reputation as a jurist who could not be swayed by tears or testimony, by personal narratives or emotional manipulation. Her courtroom was a place where feelings came to die, where only logic and evidence mattered. And for 3 decades, this approach had served her well. Her cases rarely went to appeal. Her decisions were cited in legal textbooks. Lawyers respected her, feared her, prepared meticulously for her courtroom because they knew sentiment would get them nowhere. But in this moment, staring into the eyes of a golden retriever with his chin resting on her desk, Judge Harrison felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty. Max's eyes were brown and intelligent and utterly without agenda. There was no judgment in them, no accusation, no attempt at manipulation. There was only presence, pure, uncomplicated presence. The dog wasn't performing tricks or seeking approval. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He was simply there, existing, offering himself without condition or expectation. The judge's hand remained on his fur. His coat was soft, golden in the afternoon light streaming through the courtroom windows. She could feel the warmth of his body beneath her fingers. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and true and alive. When was the last time she'd touched a living creature without purpose or protocol? When was the last time she'd experienced something that existed outside the rigid structure of law and precedent? Judge Harrison became acutely aware of the silence in the courtroom. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do. The bailiff stood frozen mid-step, uncertain whether this was a breach of courtroom protocol that required intervention. Richardson's mouth was open slightly, his aggressive confidence momentarily displaced by confusion, looked genuinely bewildered, as if his carefully constructed world had been interrupted by something he couldn't categorize or control. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, unsure whether to document this moment or wait for explicit instruction. But it was Sarah's face that caught the judge's attention. In the corner of her vision, Judge Harrison saw tears streaming down the young woman's cheeks. Not hysterical tears, not manipulative tears, but genuine tears, tears of desperation and hope and raw, vulnerable truth. Sarah's hands were pressed against her mouth, her body shaking slightly. And beside her, the elderly attorney looked as shocked as anyone else in the room. Judge Harrison's fingers traced the curve of Max's ear. The dog didn't move. He didn't lick her hand or try to climb onto the bench. He simply maintained that steady, unwavering connection. His eyes communicated something that no testimony or expert witness had managed to convey all morning and afternoon. He communicated trust. He communicated that love was real. He communicated that broken things were still worthy of care. 30 years ago, when Judge Harrison had first taken the bench, she believed that the law was pure and objective and good. She believed that if you simply applied the rules correctly, justice would emerge. But over the decades, she'd watched cases like this one, parents struggling with mental health, poverty, bad luck, systemic disadvantage, get crushed beneath the weight of a system that rewarded wealth and stability while punishing vulnerability and struggle. She'd seen children separated from loving parents because of circumstances that had nothing to do with actual parenting ability. She'd learned to harden herself against the emotional toll of these decisions. But this dog, this impossible, perfect dog, he had bypassed every legal argument, every expert testimony, every carefully constructed case. He had reached past her judicial armor and touched something she'd thought was long dead. Judge Harrison realized she was thinking of her own daughter, now 35 years old and estranged. They hadn't spoken in 7 years, not since her daughter had announced she was seeking therapy to deal with emotional neglect during childhood. Judge Harrison had been affronted by this. She had provided everything: private schools, piano lessons, college tuition, a structured, stable home. She hadn't understood how her daughter could claim to have suffered emotional neglect when she'd been given every material advantage. But now, in this moment, she understood something she'd refused to acknowledge for decades: that stability and structure weren't the same thing as love, that emotional presence mattered more than financial provision, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was the truest form of strength. That showing up, admitting struggle, fighting to be better, these were acts of profound love. Max shifted slightly and Judge Harrison's hand remained in place. She became aware of the physical sensation of tears on her own face. When had she started crying? She couldn't remember, but her cheeks were wet and her vision was blurred, and her professional composure, carefully cultivated over 3 decades, was crumbling like ancient stone. She thought about what she'd seen that morning and afternoon. Not the facts as presented by expensive lawyers, but the truth underneath. She'd seen a woman who'd admitted her weaknesses. She'd seen a mother who'd sought help rather than pretending everything was fine. She'd seen someone fighting with every fiber of her being to be worthy of her son. And she'd seen and his team, with their expensive suits and their orchestrated testimony, trying to destroy her for the crime of being human. The judge's hand trembled slightly as she continued to touch Max's head. Around her, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she call the bailiff? Would she remove the dog from her courtroom? Would she maintain the rigid structure that had defined her judicial career? Instead, Judge Harrison did something she'd never done in 30 years on the bench. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Max's, just for a moment. Just long enough for the dog to shift his weight, just long enough for his warm breath to touch her face, just long enough for her to feel something break open inside her chest, some dam that had held back decades of suppressed emotion. "What is your name?" the judge asked quietly, not looking up from the dog. "Who does this dog belong to?" "His name is Max," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He belongs to me and to my son." Judge Harrison pulled back and Max remained with his chin on the desk, his eyes unwavering. The judge looked directly at Sarah now, and something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The coldness was gone. In its place was something more honest, more human. "I need to take a brief recess," Judge Harrison announced, her voice slightly hoarse. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. She stood and walked off the bench without further explanation, leaving the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Richardson stood uncertainly, seemingly unable to comprehend what had just happened, looked genuinely confused, as if a fundamental rule of the universe had been violated. And Sarah, with her hands still pressed to her mouth, watched the judge disappear through the door to her chambers. Max gently his chin from the bench and turned, walking back to Sarah with the same calm, measured pace he'd used approaching the judge. He settled at her feet, and Sarah buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking with release. Jim placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes wide with astonishment. "I have no idea what just happened," he whispered. "But I think something just changed everything." The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity. Sarah sat in the courtroom gallery with Max's head resting on her lap, her fingers trembling as she stroked his ears. Jim had excused himself to use the restroom, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her dog. She couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Judge Harrison's expression had transformed in that moment, from impenetrable judicial authority to something almost vulnerable, almost human. But Sarah knew better than to hope. Judicial moments of emotion didn't necessarily translate into favorable rulings. Judges were trained to compartmentalize. By the time Harrison returned to the bench, she might have rationalized the emotional moment away, retreated back behind her walls of logic and precedent. Across the courtroom, and Richardson huddled in heated conversation, clearly panicked. Richardson kept gesturing emphatically, his face flushed with agitation. This was outside his playbook, Sarah realized. He'd built a case on carefully controlled narratives and expert testimony, and Max had bypassed all of it with something Richardson couldn't fight: truth. But's lawyer was already strategizing, probably preparing arguments about the impropriety of allowing emotional support animals to influence judicial proceedings, probably formulating ways to spin this moment into something that worked in his favor. At 5:22 p.m., the bailiff announced that the judge was returning. Everyone rose. Judge Harrison took her seat, and Sarah noticed something different about her. Her hair was slightly more disheveled, as if she'd run her fingers through it repeatedly. Her eyes were slightly red-rimmed. She looked like she'd been crying in her chambers. She looked human. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, her voice carrying a different tone than it had all day, softer, more measured, more curious. "Please approach the bench." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she stood and walked forward. Max remained at the gallery seat, watching her with those intelligent brown eyes. The judge gestured for Sarah to come closer, and when she did, Judge Harrison said quietly, "Tell me about your dog." It wasn't a trick question. Sarah could tell by the judge's expression that she genuinely wanted to understand. Still, Sarah chose her words carefully. "His name is Max. He's a 3-year-old golden retriever. I adopted him because I needed help, because my son needed help." "What kind of help?" the judge asked, and there was genuine interest in her voice, not the prosecutorial probing that had characterized most of the day's questioning. Sarah took a breath. This was her moment. This was where she could tell the real story, not the carefully constructed narrative that either legal team had presented, but the actual truth of her life. "Your Honor, I struggle with anxiety. I've struggled with it my whole life, but it became really severe about 3 years ago, right around the time my marriage was falling apart. I couldn't function. I couldn't leave my house sometimes. I'd have panic attacks that felt like I was dying. I was terrified that I was damaging my son with my illness." The judge listened without interrupting, her pen still in her hand but not moving. She was fully present, fully focused on Sarah's words. "When my marriage ended," Sarah continued, her voice shaking slightly, "Tommy was devastated. He couldn't understand why his father was leaving. He developed anxiety too. He started having nightmares, separation anxiety, all kinds of behavioral issues. I realized I had to get better, not just for myself but for him. I couldn't be the mother he needed if I was drowning, so I got help. I was hospitalized voluntarily. I found medication that worked. I found a therapist. And I got Max." "Why Max specifically?" Judge Harrison asked. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because Tommy suggested it. He was watching me struggle and he asked if there was a dog that could help me feel brave. He said he wanted a dog that could help both of us. Max has been everything. He's helped Tommy feel safe. He's helped me stay grounded. When I have a panic attack, he knows before I do, and he just sits with me until it passes. He's given my son and me a reason to keep fighting." The judge set down her pen and folded her hands. "Tell me about the command, the one he obeyed in my courtroom." Sarah's voice trembled. "About 3 weeks ago, Tommy was having a particularly bad night. He was worried about this custody case. He was worried about losing me or you, his father, or some version of losing his stability. He asked me what would happen if the judge didn't like me, if the judge thought I was too broken. And I told him that broken things could still be strong." The judge's eyes glistened. "Tommy suggested that we teach Max something, a way for us to show other people that even though we were struggling, we were also brave and strong and loved each other. So we created a command together. Show them your heart, Max. It means show them that we're okay. Show them that love is real even when everything else feels like it's falling apart. We practiced it together, and it became a ritual between us. Every time things got scary, we'd practice it, and it would remind us that we had something real that couldn't be taken away by lawyers or courts or circumstances." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I don't have anxiety. I do. I probably always will, but I've learned to manage it. I've learned to get help. I've learned that admitting struggle doesn't make me a bad mother. It makes me a good one because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be present for my son. Can provide financial stability. His girlfriend can provide whatever she provides. But I provide something that can't be bought or manufactured or strategized by expensive lawyers. I provide unconditional love. I provide a model of fighting through difficulty instead of running from it. I provide a mother who gets back up every time she falls down." The judge was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "In 30 years of hearing custody cases, I've heard countless arguments about who can provide better material circumstances, better education, better financial security. What I rarely hear about is this: the raw, unfiltered truth of what it means to love your child so much that you're willing to be vulnerable, willing to struggle in front of them, willing to model resilience instead of perfection." "I'm not a perfect mother," Sarah said quietly. "I have bad days, days when my anxiety spikes and I have to work really hard to function. But I've never, not once, made Tommy feel responsible for my struggles. I've never asked him to take care of me. What I have done is show him that people who love each other support each other, that asking for help is brave, that brokenness doesn't diminish worth." Judge Harrison pulled off her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she looked up at Sarah again, there was something fundamentally different in her expression. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, not for the record, not for the lawyers, for me." "Of course," Sarah said. "Are you a good mother?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am. I'm not perfect, but I'm present. I'm loving. I'm fighting like hell every single day to be worthy of my son's trust. And I would do anything, literally anything, to protect him and help him grow into a good man." The judge nodded slowly. She looked toward the gallery where Max sat watching, then back to Sarah. "I need to speak with your ex-husband and his legal team privately. But first, I want to tell you something. What happened in this courtroom today was unprecedented. An emotional support animal intervened in a custody proceeding in a way I've never witnessed. But more importantly, what happened was that I was reminded of something I'd forgotten. That behind all the legal arguments and expert testimony and carefully constructed narratives, there are real people, real parents, real children, real love." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Judge Harrison said. "But I can tell you that everything you've said today has changed how I'm viewing this case. Not because of the dog, though the dog certainly made an impression, but because you've shown me the truth, not the edited truth, not the strategic truth, but the actual, messy, beautiful human truth of who you are and how much you love your son." She gestured for the bailiff. "Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. I'm going to speak with Mr. Mitchell and his legal team, and then we're going to discuss what justice actually looks like in this case." Sarah walked back to her seat in a daze. Jim appeared beside her, his eyes wide with questions, but Sarah was focused only on Max. She sank to the floor beside her dog and buried her face in his fur, finally allowing the tears to flow freely. When court reconvened at 5:47 p.m., the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Judge Harrison looked different, more alert, more purposeful, as if the private conversation in her chambers had crystallized something within her. She sat down and immediately addressed his legal team. Richardson stood, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and barely concealed panic. "Before we proceed," Judge Harrison began, her voice sharp and authoritative, "I have some questions for Mr. Mitchell and his counsel regarding the evidence presented this morning." Richardson cleared his throat nervously. "Of course, Your Honor." "The surveillance footage that was presented," Judge Harrison said, adjusting her glasses and looking directly at Richardson, "was that footage presented in its entirety, or were specific moments selected for presentation?" Richardson hesitated. "Your Honor, we selected representative moments that demonstrated." "That's not what I asked," the judge interrupted, her tone glacial. "Was it the entire recording or selected moments?" "Selected moments," Richardson admitted quietly. "And when you selected these moments," Judge Harrison continued, "did you include footage from before or after the hospitalization, showing Miss Mitchell's recovery?" "Your Honor," Richardson began, "those moments weren't relevant to—" "Objection sustained," Judge Harrison said sharply. "Or rather, I'm sustaining my own objection to the manner in which evidence was presented. The court finds that the surveillance footage was presented in a deliberately misleading manner, designed to create a distorted narrative rather than provide objective documentation." Sarah felt Jim grip her arm. She could barely breathe. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "I'm troubled by the testimony presented this morning regarding Miss Mitchell's employment history. Miss Carroll, who that Miss Mitchell's work performance was concerning, has anyone on your legal team whether Miss Mitchell maintained her employment throughout her treatment, or whether her supervisor's assessment was accurate?" Richardson looked genuinely panicked now. "Your Honor, I had my clerk call the design firm during recess," Judge Harrison announced, and Sarah Saw's face go pale. "Miss Mitchell was not terminated. In fact, the actual supervisor stated that Miss Mitchell was one of their most reliable employees and that any adjustments to her schedule were temporary and fully accommodated. Miss, it turns out, was fired from that position 2 years ago for falsifying expense reports. So her credibility as a witness is, shall we say, questionable." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sarah's hands started shaking. This was real. This was actually happening. Judge Harrison banged her gavel once sharply. "I'm not finished. I've also had my clerk review the psychiatric evaluation provided by Dr. I'm told, never met with Miss Mitchell. Is that correct?" "That's standard practice in custody evaluations," Richardson began defensively. "Doctor reviewed the—" "I asked if he met with the respondent," Judge Harrison said coldly. "Answer the question." "No, Your Honor." "So doctor provided expert testimony regarding Miss Mitchell's mental health without ever having an actual evaluation with her," Judge Harrison stated flatly. "He formed his opinions based on medical records that, by the way, were presented to him by your office in highly selective fashion. This court finds doctor's testimony to be based on incomplete information and therefore of limited evidentiary value." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Judge Harrison was systematically dismantling this entire case, revealing the careful construction of lies and half-truths that had felt so overwhelming that morning. "Now, let me discuss what I actually observed in this courtroom today," Judge Harrison said, leaning forward slightly. "I observed a mother who admitted her struggles. I observed a woman who sought help rather than denying her problems. I observed someone who fought her way back from a psychiatric hospitalization and has maintained her stability. I observed testimony regarding her love for her son that was entirely credible." His attorney started to stand, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look. "I also observed," the judge continued. A carefully orchestrated campaign designed to portray Miss Mitchell as an unfit mother based on selective evidence, misleading testimony, and expert opinions formed without adequate evaluation. I observed an ex-husband with significantly greater financial resources using the legal system as a weapon. His face turned a mottled red. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm. "What I did not observe," Judge Harrison said, her voice growing softer, "was any credible evidence that Miss Mitchell is incapable of providing loving, stable parenting. To the contrary, every objective measure suggests she's a devoted mother who has worked extraordinarily hard to maintain her relationship with her son despite her mental health challenges." She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I also observed something unusual today, an animal who communicated more truth about his owner's character than any testimony or evidence presented by expensive lawyers. The dog didn't lie. The dog didn't misrepresent. The dog simply showed us what was real, that Miss Mitchell is loved and that she is worthy of that love." Sarah thought her heart might actually stop. "Here is my ruling," Judge Harrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "Effective immediately, Sarah Mitchell is granted primary physical and legal custody of Thomas James Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell will have supervised visitation every other weekend, pending the results of a comprehensive psychological evaluation of his motivations in this case, which I am ordering to begin immediately." The courtroom erupted, stood up, shouting something incoherent. Richardson was frantically gathering papers, his face a mask of disbelief, but Sarah heard only the judge's voice echoing through the chaos. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion, "I am ordering the plaintiff's legal team to submit an explanation of their evidence presentation methodology for potential disciplinary review. The manner in which this case was constructed, with deliberately misleading evidence and strategically selected testimony, represents a troubling abuse of the legal process." Jim was squeezing Sarah's hand so hard it hurt. He was saying something, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Sarah was focused entirely on the judge, who was now looking directly at her. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, and the courtroom quieted to hear her final words, "you have demonstrated remarkable courage in this proceeding. You've been honest about your struggles and your strengths. You've shown that you understand the meaning of being a parent, not someone who presents a perfect facade, but someone who is willing to be vulnerable and real for their child's sake. I commend you." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. "The court is adjourned," Judge Harrison announced, and she stood, clearly wanting to exit before the chaos fully erupted. As the bailiff called for order stood and pointed at Sarah, "This is bullshit. You've brainwashed this judge. This isn't over." His attorney pulled him down, whispering urgently, probably explaining that any further outbursts would only damage his already demolished case. Jim stood up and pulled Sarah into an embrace, tears streaming down his face. "We did it," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't believe it, but we did it. We actually won." Sarah couldn't respond. She was in shock, her body trembling from the release of months and months of accumulated terror and uncertainty. She looked toward the gallery where Max sat, his tail wagging slowly, as if he understood that something fundamental had changed. Stormed out of the courtroom with his lawyer trailing behind, Richardson looking like a man who'd been struck by lightning. Several people in the gallery, spectators who'd remained for the afternoon session, actually applauded quietly, a subtle expression of solidarity with Sarah's victory. News reporters who'd been waiting outside somehow got wind of the ruling almost immediately. Within minutes, Sarah heard commotion in the hallway, but Jim guided her quickly away from the main corridor, toward a side exit. As they walked, Sarah felt Max press against her leg, grounding her, reminding her that this was real. "What happens now?" Sarah asked Jim, her voice still shaking. "Now," Jim said, a broad smile spreading across his face, "we go get your son. You get to tell Tommy that you're keeping custody. You get to tell him that the court agrees with what he already knew, that you're a good mother. And then you get to start rebuilding your life without the shadow of this case hanging over you. Just like that, Sarah asked, still unable to believe it was real. Just like that, Jim confirmed. The judge was very clear. You have primary custody, has supervised visitation only. And honestly, after this performance, his attorney is going to have a hard time explaining to the Bar Association why they presented deliberately misleading evidence. As they approached the courthouse exit, Sarah could see the afternoon sun beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A new day was beginning, a day where she was no longer fighting for the right to be her son's mother. A day where the law had finally recognized the truth. Sarah's mother was waiting in the courthouse lobby with Tommy. The moment the 8-year-old saw his mother emerge from the courtroom, he broke away from his grandmother's hand and ran toward her, his small frame moving with the urgency of a child who'd been separated from safety for far too long. Sarah dropped to her knees and caught him, pulling him into her arms as he buried his face against her shoulder. "Did we win, Mommy? Did we win?" Tommy asked, his voice muffled against her jacket. "We won, baby. We won," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You get to stay with me. The judge said you get to stay with me." Tommy pulled back to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder and relief. "Really? For real?" "For real," Sarah confirmed. Then she noticed Max, and his entire face transformed into pure joy. The dog had followed her out of the courtroom and now stood beside them, his tail wagging so hard his entire back half was wiggling. Tommy threw his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the dog's golden fur. "Max did it," Tommy said, his voice filled with awe. "Max showed them your heart like we practiced." Sarah's mother embraced both of them, tears flowing freely. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered to Sarah. "So incredibly proud." As they left the courthouse, Sarah caught sight of a small crowd of reporters and news cameras gathering near the front entrance. Jim noticed them too and gently guided Sarah toward a side exit. "Give it a day or two," he advised. "The story's going to get out regardless, but you don't need to feed it right now. You need time with your son." The drive home felt surreal. Sarah kept expecting to wake up, to discover that the judge's ruling had been a beautiful dream that evaporated in the harsh light of reality. But Tommy's presence in the back seat, asking 1,000 questions about what happened in the courtroom, what the judge said, whether Max had really walked to her desk, kept her grounded in the reality of victory. Max's head rested on Tommy's lap, and the boy stroked the dog's ears repeatedly, as if confirming that this was real, that Max was actually here, that everything had actually changed. That night, Sarah ordered pizza and they ate on the living room floor, all three of them, Sarah, Tommy, and Max. Tommy wanted to hear the entire story of what happened in the courtroom that afternoon. Sarah told him everything, about the judge's face when Max approached her desk, about the recess where Judge Harrison had composed herself, about the way the judge had systematically dismantled his case. "The judge cried," Sarah told him. "Did you know that judges can cry?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? Really? And do you know what she said to me after? She said that what we created together, the command, the ritual, all of it, that was more powerful than any lawyer or any evidence. She said that real love is real, and no amount of money or fancy arguments can change that." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew Max would help. I knew it in my heart." Sarah pulled her son close and held him, marveling at his wisdom, at his faith, at the strength he'd shown through circumstances no child should have to endure. 3 days later, the story went viral. A court reporter named Michael had been covering the custody case for a local news website. Intrigued by the unusual moment with Max, he'd done additional research, speaking with courtroom observers, consulting with legal experts, investigating the judge's unprecedented ruling and her stated reasons for dismantling's case. What discovered was a compelling narrative. A mother struggling with mental illness who'd fought her way to stability, an ex-husband using the legal system as a weapon, and a dog who'd somehow communicated truth more powerfully than any expert witness. This article, titled "Justice Interrupted: How One Woman's Service Dog Changed Everything," was picked up by regional news outlets within hours. Within 24 hours, it had gone national. Major news networks reached out requesting interviews. Threads exploded with people sharing their own stories of mental health struggles, of fighting custody battles, of the way emotional support animals had transformed their lives. Sarah's phone rang constantly. News producers wanted her to appear on morning shows. Mental health advocacy organizations wanted her to speak at conferences. Animal therapy specialists wanted to collaborate on research. It was overwhelming and terrifying, and absolutely not what Sarah had anticipated when she'd whispered that command to Max in the courtroom. But there was something else too, something that moved Sarah profoundly. Messages poured in from people who'd seen themselves in her story. Mothers who'd been hospitalized for mental health issues and feared they were unfit parents. People who'd been discriminated against because of psychiatric diagnoses. Children who'd been separated from loving parents by legal systems that didn't understand the complexity of mental illness. Each message felt like a small brick in a wall that was growing stronger every day, a wall built from the testimony of people who understood what it meant to struggle and survive. Judge Harrison became an unexpected advocate in the wake of the case's publicity. She gave interviews to legal journals discussing the importance of recognizing mental health advocacy in custody proceedings. She began work on policy recommendations regarding emotional support animals in courtrooms. More significantly, she reached out to Sarah privately. They met for coffee 2 weeks after the ruling. Judge Harrison looked different outside the courtroom, more approachable, more human. She'd brought her daughter with her, a woman in her mid-30s who Sarah later learned had been estranged from the judge for 7 years. "I owe you an apology," Judge Harrison said quietly after the initial pleasantries. "Not just as a judge, but as a human being. Your case made me realize something about myself that I'd been avoiding for a long time. I've been so focused on being objective that I forgot how to be compassionate. And worse, I'd passed that same coldness on to my daughter." The judge's daughter reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. Judge Harrison continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened in my courtroom that day, about how a dog communicated something that I'd become incapable of understanding, that people are complex, that struggle doesn't diminish worth, that love is more powerful than law." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she simply listened. "I'm working with animal therapy organizations now," Judge Harrison explained. "I'm advocating for policy changes that would allow emotional support animals in more courtroom proceedings. I'm also going through therapy myself, something I probably should have done decades ago, to understand why I'd built such walls around my own emotions." Later, as they were leaving the coffee shop, Judge Harrison pulled Sarah aside. "I'm meeting with my daughter again next week," she said softly. "For the first time in 7 years, there's actually hope that we might rebuild our relationship, and I have you and Max to thank for that. You showed me that it's not weakness to acknowledge struggle. You showed me that vulnerability is actually strength." 6 months after the court ruling, Sarah and Tommy started volunteering at a local animal shelter. They worked with rescued dogs, helping to place them in homes. Tommy had a natural gift for understanding which dogs matched which families, which animals needed quiet, patient people, and which thrived with active, energetic households. He'd become something of a small ambassador for animal therapy, and shelters across the region started calling to ask if he could consult on placements. More significantly, Sarah and Tommy launched a small nonprofit called Heart Show, dedicated to training emotional support animals for children dealing with parental mental health issues, custody disputes, and family trauma. The organization's mission was simple: to ensure that other families had access to the kind of support Max had provided. Meanwhile, had faded from their lives. His supervised visitation had been gradually decreased after a psychological evaluation revealed what Judge Harrison had suspected, that his custody pursuit had stemmed not from genuine concern for Tommy, but from a need to control and punish Sarah. He'd eventually declined visitation altogether, and Sarah had stopped fighting to maintain it. Tommy seemed relieved by the absence of the stressful transitions. 1 year after the court ruling, Sarah stood in front of a room full of mental health professionals, lawyers, and animal therapists, speaking about her experience. Max lay at her feet, calm and present, a living symbol of what she'd been fighting for. "I want to be clear about something," Sarah said, looking out at the assembled crowd. "This isn't a story about a miracle dog. Max didn't cure my anxiety. Max didn't make my mental health challenges disappear. What Max did was represent love. What Max did was remind me, and eventually Judge Harrison, that broken people can still be strong, that admitting struggle is brave, that asking for help is a sign of character, not weakness." She paused, feeling Tommy's presence in the front row, where he sat with her mother. "What I learned through this process is that the legal system, and society in general, often punishes people for being human. We punish mothers for struggling with mental illness. We punish people for admitting that they need help. We reward those who present perfect facades while destroying those who dare to be vulnerable. But here's what I also learned: that vulnerability can actually be a superpower. When you admit your struggles, you give other people permission to do the same. When you fight to be better, you model resilience. When you love fiercely despite your brokenness, you show that love is real and unconditional and worth fighting for. Sarah looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with those same unwavering, intelligent eyes that had changed everything in Judge Harrison's courtroom. "And sometimes," she continued, "the truth needs to be communicated by a dog, because people have gotten too good at lying with words." The audience applauded. Sarah felt Tommy's hand slip into hers from the side of the stage. Judge Harrison sat in the third row, her daughter beside her, and she nodded at Sarah with something that looked like recognition, one survivor acknowledging another. That evening, after the event, Sarah sat on her porch with Max, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. Tommy was inside, doing homework, completely at peace in a way he'd never been during the custody battle. Sarah stroked Max's ears and whispered words he'd heard 100 times. "Thank you for showing them my heart." Max's tail thumped against the wooden floor, a rhythm as steady and true as the love that had carried them all through the darkness and into this new, bright, beautiful life. The broken things, Sarah had learned, were often the strongest, and the most powerful truth was the one spoken not in words, but in the language of unconditional love. "Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses."